Thank you all for joining us today. I realized I hadn't yet put us on Facebook, so I'll do that very quickly, and then we can get Nicole to get started. Alrighty, thank you all for your patience, and we can go ahead and welcome Nicole Franklin. Welcome all of you. My name is Erin Stagletter. I'm the Education Manager for the Virginia Breast Cancer Foundation. Today we'll be hearing from Nicole Franklin from Cancer and Careers. Nicole is Senior Manager of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and in this role, she oversees Cancer and Careers' annual research projects, the expansion of awareness and outreach efforts through CAC's social media platforms and PR activities, and the production of the bi-monthly newsletter. Additionally, she serves as editor for the website's news feed, manages CAC's annual regional conferences, and provides support for website operations and special projects. Nicole received her Bachelor of Arts degree in African American Studies from Oberlin College and her Master of Public Health degree with a concentration in International Health and Development from Tulane University. Nicole will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So if any come up for you while she is speaking, you can enter them in the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, Nicole, you can share your screen whenever you're ready, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for that introduction, Erin, and welcome everyone. I am going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. How does that look? Good? Awesome. All right. So hi, everyone. As Erin mentioned, my name is Nicole Franklin, and I am Senior Manager of Programs at Cancer and Careers. And I'm really excited to speak with you all this afternoon to discuss some of the major issues that sit at the intersection of work and cancer. There's a good amount of information to get through, so I do encourage you, as Erin said, to hold your questions until after the presentation when we can take some time for Q&A. All right. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Cancer and Careers was founded in 2001 and is the only organization in the US that is solely focused on work and cancer issues. We provide support through a number of programs and resources that are always provided free of charge. And our website is really our main hub for information on our programs and services, which include publications in English and Spanish, which we will ship anywhere in the US for free. Online career coaching and a resume review service, educational webinars, which take place throughout the year and are also archived on our website, and other educational events, which are now all virtual for the time being, but that includes our conference, our national conference on work and cancer, which is taking place virtually on Friday, June 25th. So I definitely encourage you to register for that. Before we jump in, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the constantly shifting landscape due to the pandemic and how it's impacting all of our lives, both professionally and personally. There are those of us that are still working from home, others who have recently returned to their workplaces or have had to report to work throughout the pandemic. And then there are those, unfortunately, who have lost employment or have had their hours significantly reduced. Additionally, I'd imagine that many of you are in different places in terms of your own story and the things that you're thinking about. Maybe some of you have just received your diagnosis, but maybe there are those of you who have already made decisions about working through treatment and are already an expert in your own right. Maybe some of you are squarely into survivorship, but you're dealing with some long-term side effects from treatment. And maybe there are those of you that are looking for your first job ever. And of course, with COVID-19, there's now a whole new layer to all of those things. But regardless of where you are today, you'll hopefully find some things that apply now and maybe some that you can take away with you. We're going to start today by thinking about the various tensions and challenges that come up after receiving a diagnosis. Specifically, when we start thinking about work and life and how things are going to come together, it's important to recognize that a lot of questions start to come up. And sometimes the answers to those questions are naturally in conflict with one another. So there are two overarching questions that you can ask that can help to start illuminate the best path forward for you. First, how important is work to you personally? And what information do you actually need to make good decisions about work? Inevitably, this is going to lead to a host of additional questions because, as we know, what we want is not always what we can do. So how do we find a path that is workable? Some additional questions to consider include, how will treatment affect your work and schedule and vice versa? When you're talking with your healthcare team, you'll want to think about things like, when are side effects likely to kick in? With some treatments, people feel unwell almost immediately, which in that case, maybe scheduling treatment for Friday makes the most sense so you have the weekend to recover. Sometimes with other treatment protocols, the effects don't kick in until a few days later, in which case scheduling the appointment for Wednesday makes the most sense. Obviously, in some cases, your doctor is going to need you to come in on a certain day, but sometimes the date they propose is just the next available slot. So I'm just encouraging you to be proactive and ask for times that work best for your schedule. And of course, no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what are other things you'll want to save energy for? A new hobby or a personal project? Or maybe you're the one who does all the cooking and cleaning at home. The truth is that each of us has a limited pool of internal resources and energy that we divvy up into our own personal pie chart. And when cancer gets added to the mix, that pie gets smaller and smaller as treatment continues. So prioritizing becomes even more important. For many people, finances and insurance are tied to their jobs and are very important. So often those are the driving factors in determining whether to work during treatment. Or for some people, maybe they're important, but they're not the number one reason. Many people want to continue working because first and foremost, it's part of their identity. It's who they are. Particularly in this country, when we meet someone for the first time, usually one of the first questions we ask is, what do you do? Not what's your favorite food or have you read any good books lately? So we're basically asking, how do you contribute to the world, which is a pretty profound question. So for some people, finding out that their ability to work will be compromised can lead to a secondary crisis, an identity one. And in that case, it can be really helpful to talk to your healthcare team, including a social worker, about the ways that you can take care of yourself emotionally if it looks like your ability to work will become impacted. So in an effort to answer those questions and start making decisions, you're going to need to do a lot of information gathering. And this slide illustrates the 3 buckets in which that information can be sorted. So we've already touched on the first bucket, which is medical and treatment information. But I just want to make one more point, which is it's important to share very specific information with your healthcare team about what you do for work. So it's not just enough to say, oh, I work in sales or I'm an administrator at a school. You really want to provide details about your day-to-day routine and responsibilities. The next bucket is work information. You'll want to look into the benefits you have, such as paid time off and health insurance, but also existing workplace policies, such as donated leave pools. This information can usually be found in your employee handbook or in the initial paperwork you sign when you started your job. And finally, the third category is legal information. I'm not an attorney, so while I'm going to talk about the law, I'm going to do so in very general terms. But I do strongly encourage anyone who has specific information, specific questions about their situation to reach out to a legal professional. The law does play a very important role when you're thinking and talking about work and cancer, which is why I included it. Understandably, for some, it can seem scary to think about the law and our jobs, but what I want to emphasize is that discussing this topic is not because I think that a work situation is likely to become litigious. Rather, it's because legal and practical issues do not exist in separate vacuums. So when there is a practical concern, there's sometimes or usually a legal piece tied to it as well. And for many people, the law can be a very valuable tool in helping them create a plan for working through treatment. I want to start, so on that note, I want to start by mentioning an important law that is often a key tool in navigating work after cancer, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. My goal in giving you a little background today on the ADA is that you know it's something that you can look further into based on your own situation. To start, the ADA is a federal law, meaning that it applies in all 50 states. And the part that's relevant to work and cancer comes from Title I. And like all laws, it does have certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. So in broad strokes, those are: your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. 2, you must have the necessary skills, certifications, and qualifications to do the job. And 3, your disability must meet the criteria determined by the ADA. If you meet all of those requirements, the ADA protects you from discrimination, but may also provide access to reasonable accommodations, which we're going to talk about a little later on in the presentation. Again, this is just a quick overview so that you know that the ADA is something to consider. Also, it's important to note that you may be further protected by state fair employment law. For example, I looked this up. Virginia's minimum is 1 employee, not 15. So you definitely want to look at your state-specific laws. Again, I encourage you to speak with a legal professional to determine if you are eligible to use the ADA's protections. Now, transitioning a little bit, I want to talk about the online space. At Cancer and Careers, we often hear from survivors about the role that the internet is playing in helping them through their cancer experience. For many, it creates a sense of community and a way to feel better in the moment, but it also creates a written record of information that can be difficult to get rid of. At the same time, research indicates that more and more employers and hiring managers are Googling employees and prospective candidates. And this is not necessarily to find something negative about them, but maybe to get additional information about the people they work with, or to confirm something that they already like about a job candidate. Still, in this process, they may come across information that that person would prefer that they didn't know. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying never post anything online. It can actually be a good thing to have an online presence, but rather it's important for people to have a better understanding of the virtual landscape so that they can make informed decisions about how their personal story is being shared online. Maybe some of you are now thinking, but I'm always careful with my privacy settings. Doesn't that mean I'm fully protected? And the answer to that is it's a little more complicated. So we're going to jump into that. One of the reasons it's so important to make clear decisions about what specifically you're going to share online is that privacy policies on mainstream social media platforms are constantly changing, because Facebook and sites like it are designed to sell us things. And in order to keep making new deals with advertisers, they change their privacy policies frequently and often without notice. So on the plus side, that's one of the reasons why we don't have to pay to use Facebook or Instagram, but it does make keeping up with those changes pretty impractical and time consuming. So the idea here is that you want to think about the fact that even in these online spaces where you've connected with people and they've connected with you and there are privacy settings in place, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a perfectly secure and structured system. As an alternative, which some of you may already be familiar with, are these two sites, My Lifeline and CaringBridge. But for those of you who aren't, they're both social networking sites that are specifically designed to be a safe space to share updates about your cancer experience. They are in a more controlled environment and have a higher level of privacy than mainstream social media networks. But while their privacy policies are easier to follow, that doesn't mean they're 100% automatically protected. So if you're going to use either of these sites, it's just worth taking time to read through their privacy policies, figure out what protections are offered, and decide which one is going to work best for you. And in general, it's just a good idea to review the privacy policies on any website where you're sharing personal information. So now that we know that many privacy policies provide imperfect protection, what are some other steps we can take? We recommend developing a personal disclosure plan. One step is to make clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share online and off, and where you're going to share it in terms of specific websites and blogs. And as you're thinking through what's going to work best for you, it's a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. It may be the case that some of you have already disclosed at work and everyone's being really supportive, and that is an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is that the internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond the right now and consider the long-term impact of disclosure, because of course none of us can predict the future. So you may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your supportive manager may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And there's just no way to tell how that person is going to respond to the information they find. So then once you've made those decisions, you want to communicate them to the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people you're just connected to online. And even once you've shared those preferences with your loved ones, it's still a good idea to monitor what people are posting just so you have a sense of what's out there. So this leads us to the question, what can you do to take control of what shows up about you in a Google search? And I'm happy to say there are plenty of opportunities to take control of what comes up about you in searches by taking a strategic approach to what you post online. People don't know what you don't share with them, and in a work context, social media can be a forum where you not only tell, but show people who you are as a professional. Social media sites like LinkedIn and Twitter and the other ones I've listed on this slide rank very high in Google searches. So becoming active on these sites and presenting a voice that represents who you are as a professional is an excellent way to elevate your brand. When building an online brand, you want to think strategically about what you post. So we recommend running each post through a filter and asking yourself questions like the ones listed on this slide. Would you want a boss, current or future, or coworkers to know about this? And the other two questions here. So taking that approach. And while you can always delete posts that no longer represent your interests, you just want to keep in mind that though they may be harder to find, it's possible they're still out there. Okay, so now we are going to transition from the online space to the actual work environment and talk about working through treatment. And here is just some data to set the scene, which comes from a survey we did with Harris Poll in 2019. First, at the top of the slide, you'll see the top 5 reasons survivors continue to work after a diagnosis. While financial reasons and health insurance were rated as highly important, which isn't surprising, what's significant is that 60% of survivors wanted to keep working because it made them feel productive. And also work played a large role in helping things to feel normal, whatever normal was for them, and provide a routine. Also, a solid 75% of employed survivors reported that working during treatment helped them cope during their cancer journey. So what all of this illustrates goes back to that point we discussed earlier, which is that work provides a sense of meaning and purpose a lot of the times, and that can be really important as people are going through treatment. So this question is definitely a top 5 question we get at Cancer and Careers. So when it comes to disclosing at work, like the rest of the decisions around sharing this news, it is an incredibly personal decision and one that requires a lot of thought. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario, can fall on a spectrum. But just so that we're all on the same page, you are not required to provide information about your health or health history to your employer, current or prospective, nor can they ask. That said, there are some situations where you might have to share some information in order to access your rights under the law. This doesn't mean that you have to share every last detail about your diagnosis or prognosis. It just means that you might have to provide some support for why you're eligible to ask for whatever you're asking for. For example, it would be difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer for discrimination under the ADA if they had no idea you had a condition to discriminate against. So as you're thinking through whether to share, it's important to consider all angles. And when I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, one thing I do like to say is that you can always disclose more later, but you can't erase something that's already been said. So if there's a need for you to divulge more information down the road, you can be prepared to do that, but you don't have to offer it all up right away. And when deciding whether or not to share information about your cancer status at work specifically, there are 2 major things to consider overall. The first thing is, how will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And what are the legal benefits? What legal benefits are there to sharing this information? It's important to note that many people just disclose for a variety of reasons. For example, personal communication style. Some people are born sharers. They couldn't imagine going through such a big life-changing event and not telling other people. And then there are those who are a little more private and in fact feel really uncomfortable sharing personal information. So it's really about knowing yourself and that however you feel about sharing is valid and should be taken into account. Another thing to consider is the individual culture of your workplace. Do you work at a small organization where your colleagues feel like a second family and you talk about your kids and your weekends and your vacations? Or do you work at a larger corporation where the environment is more buttoned up and people are more competitive and have their heads down trying to get their work done all the time? Thinking about the various ways people communicate with each other on the job may help you decide if, how, and how much information you want to share at work. You might also want to think about whether someone in your workplace has gone through something similar. While you might not know of anyone who specifically went through cancer treatment, maybe you have a coworker who went out on maternity leave, or the guy a few desks down is caring for an aging parent. What kind of flexibilities did the workplace provide for them, if any? And how was the news received, both by managers and other members of the team? Were people willing to step in and pitch in, or was there grumbling behind people's backs about having to take on extra responsibilities? It can be incredibly valuable to consider these situations as you think about what you might expect out of your own experience if you do decide to share information. Another thing to consider is past performance reviews. For example, if you've been at a company for 5 years and you've always gotten gold star reviews, and now your medical team is telling you that fatigue is a side effect you're likely to experience, you might want to share that information with your employer so that there aren't any gaps in understanding if you're not suddenly meeting the same marks. Because without context, it may simply look like a decline in your performance. And if that goes into a performance review, that can have a lasting impact. Another question that we get asked a lot is, who should I tell? And as with so much of this, it's really going to vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. If you do decide to tell, we do recommend starting with whomever it'll be easiest to talk to. And for many people, that's a direct supervisor, because that's someone you have an ongoing conversation with and who can advocate for you with more senior level management. But, and this is a key point, it's important to bear in mind that most managers were never formally trained to be managers. So in that case, it can put the burden on the employee with cancer to help teach that manager what to do next. And there, we do have a manager's kit. It's a free resource of ours, which can you can refer to, and it'll help guide your conversation with your manager or employer. It gives some good talking points for that conversation. And then for other people, just speaking with their supervisor maybe isn't an option. So they might want to go to their HR department if their company does have an HR department. But perhaps the most important thing to convey in any of these conversations is that the idea that treatment is going to be fluid, and that what you're sharing today is what you know today. And that doesn't mean that it's going to apply next week or next month or 6 months from now. So it's likely to be an ongoing conversation. With all of that said, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling in terms of a conversation at work is one that can be intimidating for a lot of survivors, which is understandable. So here are just a couple of examples of how you might want to start that conversation. If this is language that you feel comfortable with, you're welcome to use it, but you can always revise it to make it your own. But overall, when you're preparing to begin these conversations, you want to be sure to weave in the idea that you want to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures both your needs and their needs are being met. You'll also want to think about the reality of your physical self in the workplace and how you personally are going to manage the potential side effects of treatment on the job. And there are a wide array of possible side effects. So as we discussed earlier, you'll want to find out from your healthcare team which ones you are likely to experience and how those can be managed at work so that you feel more comfortable and productive. It's also important to note that it's also important to think about any potential visible side effects, especially if you have chosen or chose not to disclose any information at work. Because if your colleagues do start to notice that you're losing weight or you're losing your hair, or that your energy has dropped and you don't seem like, quote unquote, your normal, usual self, they might start to ask questions. And while these questions are typically well-intended and come from a place of kindness and concern, they can catch people off guard and create a situation where people might end up disclosing something that they didn't intend to. So it's just smart to spend some time planning out potential answers to these questions or those questions, and social workers can actually be a really good resource in this capacity. As we discuss side effects, chemo brain, or it can also be called brain fog, is one that we get asked about most frequently. And this type of fog can come about whether you've received chemotherapy or not. And while there's no magic bullet solution, one piece of advice is to just let go of the idea of multitasking, because studies show that only 2% of people can effectively multitask. So to combat this, we recommend going back to the basics, and that means writing down your list of priorities, turning off your phone and or email notifications so that they don't cause unnecessary distractions, and really try focusing on one thing at a time. Writing everything down is good practice so that you always have a written record and you don't have to rely on your memory as much. Additionally, it's a good idea to take time to rehearse everything from presentations to project updates, or even phone calls if that's helpful. And if you work in an office type environment that has a shared calendar, like an Outlook calendar, you might want to schedule blocks of time for yourself on that calendar so people see that you're busy during those times and they won't, just disrupt you. Also, simple stress relief practices can go a long way in helping to improve focus. So deep breathing exercises, or 2 to 3 minutes of meditation while you're sitting at your desk or while you're going for a short walk during your lunch break. Those can go a long way in terms of helping you hit the reset button. So shifting now back to disclosure a little bit, your disclosure decisions will drive some of your strategy around how you communicate at work. One option is to identify a point person. And while this is not feasible in all environments, in settings where it is feasible, it can be an excellent solution. So your point person is going to be someone you trust, who's willing to be a centralized source of information about you, your health, and your schedule. And this can prevent you from having to constantly update everyone on how you're feeling. That person can also be your go-to to find out about what's happening at work if you have to be away for treatment or appointments or for any other reason. It's also important to be clear about your priorities and have a good understanding of what your team is expecting from you and how you're going to deliver it. Whether or not you've disclosed, this is something you should probably do in collaboration with your supervisor if you can. And then just this final point at the bottom of the slide is about limits, which can be a real challenge. This is a time when it is critical that you're honest with yourself about what you can and cannot do at work, and that you set fair boundaries and you stick to them. Something to keep in mind here is that the way we articulate our needs in the workplace is going to be different than how we articulate those needs to a loved one at home. At home, when we've hit our wall or hit our limit, we're likely to express ourselves in a more verbal, loud, slam the door kind of way. But obviously that reaction or that behavior is not going to be acceptable at work. So then the other piece of this is figuring out what those limits are and recognizing the signs before you reach that point, and then being able to recalibrate before it happens. What often helps with this is to rehearse what we call professional no's, and I've listed a couple of examples on this slide. So getting back to reasonable accommodations, which I mentioned earlier, is one benefit of the ADA if you qualify. Reasonable accommodations are tools that can be used to make working through treatment more manageable, or working after treatment too, more manageable. So it's easier to think about how these might work with examples. So I've broken them up into categories for you on the next couple of slides. But before we move on, it's just a note. There's just a note that there's a lot of information on what a reasonable accommodation is, how to use them, and how they can be valuable for both you and your employer. For this information, definitely head to our website, cancerandcareers.org, or the other 3 sites listed on this slide. And another helpful place to look is the Q&A section of ada.gov. One type of accommodation that might be made is actually in your workplace, meaning the actual environmental challenges that exist at work. The best way to talk about these possible accommodations is to give you a few examples. So we worked with a young woman who was a social worker and going through cancer treatment, and work was incredibly important to her overall well-being and sense of self. One of her side effects was nausea, which wasn't necessarily impossible for her to manage, but what she began to note was that it was exacerbated to the point at work where it became unmanageable. What she realized was that it wasn't as bad at home or after work or during the same hours on the weekend. So it seemed a little strange that she was so sick at work specifically. So we zeroed in on that, and through some conversations, realized that her office was right next to the cafeteria. And that was what was making her nausea so bad. So in this case, her accommodation was to switch offices or change offices. And so that, doesn't necessarily mean, it didn't mean that she all of a sudden, that cancer treatment was a breeze, but it did make her ability to work more manageable, which was critical. Another example is a gentleman we worked with who worked in a finance department, and one of his side effects was extreme fatigue. His role included a lot of printing, but for some inexplicable reason, the printers and scanners were located 2 floors below him, and the most direct way to get there was via the stairs. So he was running up and down the stairs all day long to retrieve documents, essentially walking extra miles every day. And clearly this combined with his fatigue made it very challenging for him. So his accommodation was a printer at his desk. As you can see, there's no one-size-fits-all accommodation in an environmental way for every person. It's really about peeling away the layers of what's happening in your workplace, which can take some time to do, just as it did with the social worker in the cafeteria, and then being creative about possible solutions. There are also a number of questions you can ask yourself to identify potential accommodations. For example, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? This would mean that you'd ultimately work the same number of hours, but they can be distributed differently. Varying the start and end times of the workday to maximize the hours you're feeling best can be a huge help. So maybe a 9 to 5 day becomes a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. day. Or if you take time out during the workday to go to appointments, you can make up that time by working later that day or later in the week. Again, this might not work for every type of job, but it can be a great solution for people who do project-based work. If your job includes allocated break times, is it possible for you to take more frequent or additional breaks? Let's say your schedule entitles you to 2 breaks and a 45-minute lunch, but what you really need is 4 breaks in your day. Those extra breaks could potentially be considered accommodation. Again, these examples are meant to help you to start thinking about accommodations and also to remove some of the myths about the concept, myths around the concept, such as accommodations are expensive and or they're unlikely to be approved. The fact is, according to the Job Accommodation Network, most accommodations cost nothing at all, or they cost an employer $500 or less. So you want to be resourceful and really think about your environment and what might be causing the specific challenges you're experiencing. And remember, again, it's all fluid. What might work for you today might be different tomorrow, and it shouldn't be a one-time only opportunity. Returning to an existing job can present challenges whether you've been away for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or even more. And there are pros and cons to returning to a former job. Probably the biggest pro is that it's a familiar landscape. You know the culture and quirks, you know your colleagues, and you know the responsibilities associated with your particular role. All of these things mean that you won't have to spend time assessing and acclimating to a new work environment. Of course, there are cons associated with returning to a previous job. And one of those cons is the very sneaky and sometimes insidious quote unquote before cancer picture, which I think many of us have in various areas of our lives, particularly as we get older. So it's just wise to remind yourself that it's okay. And in fact, it's a good idea to ease back into a routine. And remind is an operative word, as this is often easier said than done. But it's just a helpful seed to have planted in the back of your mind. At CAC, we frequently hear from patients that they have a very real fear that they're going to be branded as the person with cancer in their workplace or their office forever. We've heard stories about colleagues making cancer-related comments to people who are returning to work. And typically, they are well-intended attempts to connect with the person in some way, but they can feel, of course, they can feel very off-putting. And what you can do in situations like that, if you encounter a comment that is a little off-putting, is use a verbal technique we refer to as the swivel. So it's a verbal formula or pattern that's used in response to a cancer-related comment that might be made by one of those well-intended colleagues. It involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and then swiveling the conversation around to a topic that's more work-oriented. By being able to shift the conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can be really empowering and also indicate to your colleagues that you're still that whole vibrant person with lots of professional contributions to make. Of course, there are a whole spectrum of comments that you might encounter in the workplace. And here is an additional example of a swivel that you might use when encountering a well-intended but off-putting comment. Just give you a couple seconds to read that. And then there are those who make comments that are just outright insensitive, like the comments on this slide. And what this really drives home is the idea that it can be useful to sit down and think about how you might personally respond if someone were to make a comment like this. So it's language that sounds like you. You might either want to write it down and practice saying it out loud so that the words feel comfortable coming out of your mouth. Both of these, again, are areas where social workers can be really helpful practicing these scenarios. Now we're going to spend a little time talking about job search. And again, we have some data from the survey we did with Harris Poll in 2019 to set us up for that conversation. Here, the first 3 data points are responses from patients and survivors who were looking for work. These are valid concerns given the 2 stats below, the 2 bullets below, like applicants who disclosed their cancer history received fewer callbacks from managers than those who did not disclose their cancer history. And I'm sharing this information with you not to scare you or to paint a negative picture, but just so you have this information in the back of your mind to help make you the savviest candidate during your job search. We're also going to spend a little time talking about disclosure during the job search. So hopefully when you finish listening to this presentation, you'll feel a little more empowered around that piece of the puzzle as well. It's no secret that there are many challenges and unknowns when looking for a new job. It can feel scary, and particularly during this time, it might feel impossible to do. To start, remember that looking for a job is a process that can take time. And while it might not feel this way right now, you should think about what you want, not just what you need, and then be strategic in your approach. We have noticed over the years that people in the cancer community tend to hold themselves to a higher standard than others who are looking for work. Often survivors feel obligated to share more of their health history than they have to or should. We like to say that job searching is like building any relationship. It's all about timing. With various steps involved, the process does build upon itself and can be heavily focused on a great first impression. And in this case, that would be your cover letter, resume, your LinkedIn profile, etc. If we were to use dating as an example of relationship building, the first phone conversation with a potential date is going to have a different feel to it than, say, a marriage proposal. So if someone shows up on a first date and is an open book, sharing all of their idiosyncrasies and quirks right out of the gate, that's going to read a little differently than if that same information came up in 6 weeks or 6 months or even 6 years. In the same way, you're not going to go on a first job interview and admit that you chew gum really loudly or that you tend to sign into Zoom meetings a few minutes late. So I encourage you to keep in mind that it's important to behave appropriately in the context of which stage you're at in the job search process. And projecting appropriate confidence and control is a great way to do so. Finally, during this time when so much can feel and is out of our control, there are thankfully elements of job searching that you can focus on right now that are completely within your control. Things like working on your resume, perfecting a cover letter, getting into the habit of networking, and just embracing the new virtual way that everyone is connecting. There are also certain things you should consider if you're job searching now. Besides the practical questions like what companies are hiring and what jobs are available, you'll also want to try to find out the safety measures and policies that employers are implementing and how important those are to you. This will likely be unique to your specific situation. So think about what you're comfortable with and what's safe, and include those in conversations with your healthcare provider. According to one of our career coaches, currently 85% of jobs are found via other people versus job boards or headhunters or ads. So it goes without saying that networking is a necessary part of the job hunting process. And when it comes to networking, it's really important not to think too narrowly. For example, that you should only network with people you worked with before, because that isn't the case. Friends, neighbors, members of your faith community are all potential contacts. There are also great online resources for this, such as LinkedIn, which I imagine many of you are familiar with. It's sort of like Facebook for professionals. LinkedIn has also become the go-to source for employers looking to hire. According to a recent study, 87% of recruiters reported that LinkedIn is the most effective tool when vetting during the job search process. As important as LinkedIn and your overall online presence are for job searching, they do not replace the time-tested tools of job hunting, starting with your resume and your cover letter. I'm likely not telling you something you don't already know, but let's just review a few tips on how to write them. An effective resume is one that's written with a particular audience in mind. It's professional, easy to read, and has impact. It also summarizes your accomplishments succinctly rather than being an exhaustive list of everything you've ever done work-wise. Rule of thumb is that if you're an early career professional, 1 page is usually enough, but 2 pages is good for someone a little more seasoned. And then lastly, lastly, a compelling resume must be future focused and targeted towards your career goal. It's also helpful to know that there's not just one type of resume. The most common is the chronological resume, which takes the reader through a candidate's work experience, job by job, beginning with the most recent. But there's also the chronological functional resume, which is more of a hybrid and could be preferable for someone who has several gaps in their work history. As mentioned, also vitally important is the cover letter or cover email. Along with your resume, it helps you get in the door. And what's key to know about a cover letter is that it should be tailored to the specific job that you're applying for. And also, it shouldn't just be a regurgitation of your resume. As I mentioned, disclosure is an important aspect to consider when it comes to job searching. A lot of people do ask us if they should include their cancer experience in their resume or cover letter, either as a positive or an explanation of some sort. My first response is always do whatever you're comfortable with, but you do want to think about this. The goal of a cover letter and resume is to get you an interview based on your skills and potential. And so in that case, your diagnosis and treatment aren't really a part of that conversation. Another important thing to consider is the fact that if you disclose your diagnosis in a letter, it won't be a dynamic exchange. And what I mean by that is that you won't physically be there when the employer initially reads and absorbs that information. So you won't have the opportunity to explain anything or answer any questions they have or to steer them back to your skills. The bottom line is that no one tells everything about everything during a job interview or even once they're hired. Communicate appropriately for where you are in the process and just do whatever feels right for you. However, if you're 100% sure that you do want to disclose during the hiring process, the cover letter and resume are not really the best way to do that. If you do feel that it's important to let your employer know about your health history before you accept a job, and I have certainly met a number of people for whom that was very important, we typically recommend that you wait until a little later on in the hiring process. This way, everyone involved in hiring has a chance to spend time with you and get a sense of who you are as a person and as an employee, instead of just reading that information in your cover letter and putting it in the no pile. So if you think back to the job searching is like dating slide, it's about sharing information based on where you are in the process. And of course, remembering that you are never required to share that information. When asked about a resume gap, putting a positive spin on the situation can greatly put the recruiter or interviewer at ease and confirm that the gap doesn't have to do with negative work ethic or laziness. Since it's possible and completely understandable that you will be asked about a gap on your resume, it's a good idea to be prepared with some responses. If it comes up, you want to be future focused, non-specific, and brief. And this slide has a couple of swivel examples that you might use in an interview situation. Of course, you want to acknowledge the question that's being asked, then swivel the interviewer's attention back to the job in question and the desire to get hired and the skill set that is on the table. That's your ultimate goal. Despite some of the negatives of Google, one of the upsides is that you can use it to research a prospective employer, and you really should do that. You want to find out as much about a company before you meet with them. Obviously, knowing about the company is going to help you sound informed during the interview, but it's also smart to spend some time thinking about whether the company is going to be a good fit for your needs. You'll want to do some fact finding beyond the conversations that happen as part of the interview process. And those are, Glassdoor is a great website to check out in that regard. So here are the pros and cons. So here the pros and cons are kind of opposite to the ones we talked about when returning to an existing role. One of the best things about starting a new job within a new employer is that it's a fresh start. According to our career coaches, research shows that your first 90 days in a job are the make it or break it time for success. This is the time when you're assimilating, you're managing your energy, meeting new people, learning the culture, and developing relationships. And remember that you don't need to work a million hours. You should just focus on creating a simple plan for the things that I mentioned, and really break everything down into small pieces so it doesn't feel overwhelming. It's important for you to learn and understand what it means to be successful in your new company. And remember that every company is dysfunctional in some way. It's also important to take care of yourself physically and mentally, and to remember people do not get hired in the hopes that they're going to fail. They get hired in the hopes that they're going to succeed. And finding the right person for a job and filling a job is time consuming and costly for an employer. So in that case, they're really going to want to do everything possible to make a success out of your employment. So just to end on that note, on a positive note. On this slide are some of our upcoming virtual events. Actually, Resumes 101 just happened yesterday, but the recording will be up on our website in the next week or so. And again, our national conference on work and cancer is taking place on June 25th. And I wanted to mention that we do have a technology assistance program. It's an application-based program where we would grant a one-time award of 1 tablet or portable laptop to a limited number of recipients. We want to make sure there's no barriers to attending our virtual conference, and we know technology can be expensive. So if that is of interest, definitely check out that program. Here are just some additional resources we offer that can help you navigate work after cancer. Our resume review service it's great. You would submit your resume, upload your resume on our website, and we'd have a career coach review it for free and give you personalized feedback on how to make it stronger. So if you're job searching, definitely check that out. And here are a list of organizations that are offering a financial assistance and/or grants to cancer patients and survivors. Our financial assistance grants program is currently on hold, but we do expect to open that in the next handful of months. So definitely check our website out for updates. And then for these other financial programs, you just want to head to these organizations' websites and know that they have different qualification requirements and deadlines. So to be aware of that. And finally, some additional resources specific to rights and protections. The Job Accommodation Network has a ton of information regarding the ADA and reasonable accommodations. So if you're interested in learning more about how those might help you in the workplace, definitely take a look at their website. It's askjan.org. And finally, here is my contact information and other ways you can connect with us on social. And we have a bi-monthly newsletter that goes out. Feel free to reach out to us anytime. If a question pops up after today, you can shoot me an email and I'll definitely get back to you. All right, and on that note, thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. I really appreciate your time. And that was a lot of great information that can definitely be applicable. And some of that stuff, I think all of us maybe would have benefited from before we got our first job, just information on how to conduct yourself in interviews and writing resumes and all that kind of stuff. So
I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah. And one question that I had was around disclosure and throughout an interview, because you know, I can understand maybe not putting it in writing because you can't explain it. And, you know, would maybe the second interview be a good time to bring it up to see if folks are willing to make accommodations that are necessary, or is it something that might be a good idea to wait until you've already gotten the offer and you're waiting to see, you know, do some of that negotiation? Just wondering, like, teasing that part out, maybe what pros and cons are for that process.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like I said, it's definitely a personal decision. So if it is something you want to bring up earlier on in the hiring process and you want that potential employer to know about your specific situation, definitely do what's comfortable for you. I would probably recommend waiting until even and once you've secured the job, talk about what you will need. And again, you don't have to disclose everything. But that's also the key part of that also too, is researching that employer, seeing what other people have reviewed and said about them. Are they accommodating? Are they flexible? We'll give you a better idea of if they will meet you halfway, or even, you know, more than halfway. They will be able to accommodate whatever needs that you have. So again, later on in the process is preferable, but do what you're comfortable with.
And as a reminder for our audience, you can enter in any questions you have in the Q&A. It's located at the bottom of your screen. One thing that stood out to me as well was, how to pivot away from uncomfortable or rude questions. And when we're dealing with breast cancer, questions about surgery decisions and things like that can be incredibly personal. And I imagine some people might ask those questions without thinking.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Yes. So, so I thought that would be beneficial for folks. Just some examples on how to deal with that and feel like you don't have to tell people your surgical or treatment decisions.
Yeah. You don't. It's so much of that is personal, and you're never required to. And I think a lot of people don't know that. And like when it comes to those off-putting comments, the swivel can be a game changer. It's such a simple verbal technique. But you'd be surprised how quickly people will forget their initial comment once you change the conversation around to something you're more comfortable with. So really getting comfortable with the swivel, like again, practicing with family or friends, having them ask you questions that you think you might encounter in the workplace, so that it feels natural in those moments when it does happen. Yeah.
And I thought it was great you mentioned the social media conversation, because we definitely see, people who are participating in fundraising events or something like that, dressing all in pink, or, the ribbon things that they put on their profile pictures. And, there's nothing wrong with that. Just thinking about how your employer or future employers might have access to that information. Is that a problem for you or not?
Yeah, really stepping back. And I mean, I think for any of us, we should have as full scope picture of what is online about us. Googling your name, looking through old social media posts, like I said, deleting things that no longer represent who you are. But the other thing is, like, if you volunteer for a cancer organization, whether you're a cancer survivor or not, even if you are a cancer survivor and you have a connection to a cancer organization, you can just talk about that connection and how it means so much to you without disclosing that you necessarily are a survivor. Their mission means so much to me. I've had people in my life, I think we've all been impacted by cancer in one way or another. So, figuring out your level of comfort with disclosure. And like I said, disclosure is on a spectrum. You can disclose everything, you can disclose nothing, or you can meet somewhere in the middle.
Is there anything in particular from your experience with the organization that wasn't included in the presentation that you think would be valuable for our folks to know?
Yeah, I highly recommend everyone go to our website, cancerandcareers.org. We have, like I said, all of our resources, information, services are at no cost. They're free of charge. We do have charts. We have information packets. Like I said, we have the manager's kit, how to engage your manager in that conversation. We have a job search toolkit, which is very specific to the job search process for a cancer patient or survivor, and goes through resumes, cover letters, interview process, LinkedIn profiles, like literally everything that goes into a job application or search process. Free publications, ongoing webinars. So we just have a plethora of events and information. So head to our website for that, and email me if you have any questions.
All right. Thanks, Nicole. Really appreciate your time. And for a reminder for folks who are watching this, we're going to have this recorded and put it on our website within the next couple of days. So if you missed any part of it, feel free to revisit the recording. And that's also a way that if you missed something from the different links that were provided or other resources, you'll be able to access it there. So Thank you all for joining us. And again, Nicole, thank you so much. We really
Thank
appreciate your
you.
time.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin. And thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.